But now the law changed where it's the least restrictive environment, meaning every child has the right to be educated in the general education setting with their typical peers. So when you look at placement in an IEP setting, you look at, can this child be educated in the general ed with special education support? So such as, we're going to pull the student out for academic instructions on reading, writing, and math, because that's something that the child needs to hone in on in a much smaller setting.
Welcome to Absolute Trust Talk with your host, Kirsten Howe. Absolute Trust Talk brings you tips, tools, advice, and interviews to help you build a reliable knowledge base on estate planning, business, and finance to start preparing for your future today.
Hello and welcome to Absolute Trust Talk. This is our live streaming version of our podcast here at Absolute Trust Council. And I'm the host today, Kirsten Howe. We're very happy to have you here and very, very happy to have our guests today. We're going to be talking about education and access to education. And probably a lot of you are aware that federal law guarantees all children, including children with disabilities, a free and appropriate education. And some children with disabilities need assistance or accommodation or some kind of resource in order to participate in a conventional classroom setting. Others might need more assistance and might need to be in a special education classroom. Every child is different and has individualized needs that must be met by the public school system. And as you can imagine, parents have to do a lot of planning, negotiation, advocacy to make sure their child gets the support and the resources that they are entitled to in order to benefit from the free public education that we have in this country. Unfortunately, many families find that the promise and the delivery don't always match. Schools have budget and staffing issues just like the rest of us. They're not always giving enough attention to the needs of students with disabilities. And when that happens, families turn to special education attorneys like our guest, Jennifer Chang. Jennifer is a California education rights attorney who fights for children with special needs to get them the education and services they are entitled to by law. These students and their families are the heart of Jennifer's practice, and she has worked over the last decade to bring them the same educational opportunities and chances given to any other student in the American school system. Equally important to Jennifer is not just advocating for the families, for the children, is educating them and helping them to learn to advocate for themselves and their child and to hold the school system accountable. Jennifer graduated from Cal State University Northridge with a BS in sociology and criminology and criminal justice. It looked like she was going to law school, don't you think, from that undergrad? She received her JD with distinction in public service from Southwestern University School of Law. And she started her own firm, Law Offices of Jennifer Chang, in order to better serve children with special needs in all types of schooling environments. And she's here today to talk to us about exactly that. Jennifer, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much for having me.
You are most welcome. I just want to first ask you, how did you get into this area of the law? What was the path?
So as you mentioned, I went to Southwestern Law School, and there is a clinic called the Children's Rights Clinic. And what we did was, under the supervision of the attorneys, we represented low-income families with children with special needs. For those of you who don't know, Southwestern is located in middle of Koreatown, and I am Korean American. And I realized the families that came in to utilize the services were either non-Korean or even non-Asian for that matter. But I also knew that just because you're an Asian descent doesn't mean you don't have a child with a disability. And I knew there was a need, but there wasn't enough of us, Asian American special ed attorneys. And so I wanted to not only educate the families, I wanted to represent, and I wanted to be a resource. So that's how I got into this area of law.
Okay, good. All right. So we are talking about your help with disabled children and getting them the education they're entitled to. But that term disability, it covers a lot of ground. Can you sort of lay out for our listeners what the range of disabilities that you help people with includes?
Sure, it's predominantly autism, and autism is a wide spectrum. So I do have clients who are on the severe side who need a lot of support, 24 hours around the clock. And then I also have, students who are on the higher functioning side who has a lot of academically they're okay, but they do have the pragmatics, the social language component that they need to maintain a healthy social relationship. And recently, what I've seen a lot is children with a specific learning disability, such as dyslexia, where the reading intervention is key. So these are the students who, unfortunately fall through the cracks because they're able to somewhat engage in classroom, but they don't comprehend 100% of it because of the language barrier, the learning disability, and I've seen a lot of them.
Okay, yeah. So it covers a lot of ground, that word disability, anything that's preventing a child from maximally participating in their education.
I would say it's probably because parents don't know, and that's why they're unable to tap into the resources. So for example, you see a lot of times a child has ADHD. And you go to the school and you say, look, my child was recently diagnosed by a medical doctor with ADHD. So is there anything the school can do? Because the recommendation will come in. You will need to reach out to the school and get some kind of support. Most often times, what the school will do is push back on that ADHD diagnosis, saying things like, oh, it's a medical diagnosis and, the student is fine accessing the curriculum. But if you really look into it, the student is not, because there's inattention issues. They can never finish an assignment independently on time. So that's going to affect testing scores at the end. So when you're little, I think it's okay. When you're at the elementary school level, you have one teacher who understands the students. So the accommodations that's required will be provided informally. But once you move to the middle school and the high school level, that's when it gets tough because you have 6, 7 teachers in. They don't really know the students that well.
Okay. Yeah, that does make sense. When you're in the same classroom all day long with the same teacher, that teacher can probably, maybe not even thinking about it, can provide the extra that child needs because they can't focus. They can't get their homework done on time. I see. Okay. But yeah, when you switch to that format of 6 different teachers every day, it doesn't necessarily happen. All right. Yeah. Okay. So as I understand it, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that right to an appropriate education, it could mean that the school has to provide assistance or support or some kind of accommodation in what I'm going to call, and might be inappropriate, the regular conventional classroom setting. Or it could mean that the child needs something beyond that. Is that accurate? Am I characterizing it correctly, even if I mangled the language?
Yes. So when I was going to school, I wasn't educated with children with special needs because they were shipped to a different school and they were just kind of all at that one particular setting the whole day. But now the law changed where it's the least restrictive environment, meaning every child has the right to be educated in the general education setting with their typical peers. So when you look at placement in an IEP setting, you look at, can this child be educated in the general ed with support, special education support? So such as we're going to pull the student out for academic instructions on reading, writing, and math, because that's something that the child needs to hone in on in a much smaller setting. Or we'll pull the student out for speech and language services. But for the majority of the time, the student is able to be placed in the gen ed setting. Most oftentimes, students with an IEP, like for example with autism, will be pulled out of gen ed because of the behavior challenges and whatnot, and they won't be able to be in gen ed, but they'll be in what's called a special day class. However, it's still at the public school setting, so they have access to some typical peers throughout the day.
Yeah, so they're going to recess with their friends and they're doing whatever, maybe PE with their friend, whatever it is, but they just can't be in that typical classroom. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm glad you said you started your answer by saying, well, when I was in school, it wasn't this way. And I was thinking that too, as I was kind of preparing for today, like this is not at all how it was when I was in school. There was no such thing as a classroom aide. That did not exist. Yeah. And the special education class, we had one on our campus but not always. Sometimes it was on a different campus. And so those kids were going to a different school. Mm-hmm. They weren't even going to our school. But my question, and I do have one, is that you mentioned a term that our listeners might not be familiar with, which is IEP. Can you explain what that means?
Sure. So, when the district does their assessment, they're going to assess the student to see if they're qualified or eligible for special education services. And once they complete the assessment and they find the student eligible, then they're going to offer what's called an individualized education plan. So it's an IEP that's individually tailored for that particular student so that student can be educated at the public school setting. So essentially, that IEP is a contract between the parent and the school district on how their child is going to be educated. So any kind of services, any kind of accommodations, any kind of particular goals that the student is going to work on has to be in that document, or else the district is not responsible for providing it.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. Okay. So, and you said it's a contract, which might be, I don't know if that's literal or figurative, but the parents have to be satisfied with the IEP.
Yes, so they do have to provide a written consent. So there's that, the written consent where I agree to consent to the IEP, and parents do have to sign it off before the school can start providing the services.
Okay, so one possible point of conflict with the school district could be right there at the IEP. The parents look at the IEP and say, no, this is not going to address all of our needs. We disagree and we won't consent. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say, and it happens a lot. I'll give you an example of when that would happen. So the child is in gen ed, and he or she is okay. Academically, she or she is able to access, but there's a lot of inattention, behavior, social-emotional component that the student is struggling. So the teacher is unable to support the child. So what parents would like is for a one-on-one aide to accompany the student so that he can better access his education at the gen ed setting. But what the district may offer is, hey, we need to step down a bit and put the student in a more restrictive environment, like such as a special day class, because it's a much smaller classroom. It's like 3 to 5 teacher-student ratio. So we want to put the student there so that the student could better access. So then there's that conflict that you see.
Right, because the parents would prefer the child, if possible, be in the general education class.
Yes.
Okay, so I just got the terminology that I'm supposed to use instead of regular, conventional, is general education. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you for that. You very tactfully corrected me. Okay, so the parents, they don't want to sign the IEP. They can push back and ask for more.
Yes, so what they would do is I disagree. And if the parents disagree with what they were offering, it becomes stay put, meaning the district has to provide the last agreed upon IEP. So in the example that I gave you, it will be gen ed. However, this is where it gets tricky is if the district truly believes that the student should be in that SDC classroom placement, then the district has an obligation to file a due process complaint against the parent.
Okay.
So then litigation will happen.
Okay. It's not, the way we think of the word complaint, it's not I'm not suing you. I have to bring this matter into the judicial system because we are at an impasse.
Mm-hmm.
And the parents can do that as well?
Absolutely. So if parents have a really good independent assessor who comes to assess and says, no, this student should be educated, he's in the right placement, there's no reason the student should be in SDC, but the district is not agreeing to it, then the parents at that point, they will now need to file. So it's going to be a race to the court in this situation, who's going to file first. But at some point, it will be a cross complaint and they will have to litigate in front of the judge. Yeah.
Okay. Is there an advantage to being the first one?
Yes, I would say if I'm the parent, I would encourage the parent to file suit as soon as possible because the child is, they're not going to change goals. They're going to work on the last, which is like the goals and, from the year ago. So for that purposes, I would encourage the parents file and let's fix the IEP so that we can have the appropriate IEP in place with the right placement, and then the student can make progress.
Okay. So it's really about getting things fixed as quickly as we can. Because if what the child needs is X and X isn't being provided, every day, every week, every month that goes by, the child's struggling. And that's where people get these big giant setbacks. And that's not what you want for your child.
No.
Okay. So this process that you're calling a due process claim, is it like civil litigation, or it's a separate track that's very uniquely laid out?
So I would say it's very similar, but we go much quicker than a civil complaint, because if we drag out a case for 2 years, it's at the detriment of the child. The child is not going to stay 5 for 2 years, right? So the court understands that we need to hurry and get this thing resolved as quickly as possible, because or else the child is not going to be able to educate. So what happens is the timeline generally is we will file, student will file for a due process. There's a, voluntary mediation. So both parties will come to an agreement on a date to mediate. And that generally happens about a month to 2 months out from the date of filing. After you mediate, if you're successful, then you have a settlement and you go back to, what you were doing. Or if it doesn't settle, then you go to hearing. Hearing is generally within anywhere from a month to 60 days at most out. So everything will get resolved within 6 months to a year, I would say.
Okay, which sounds like a long time, but you and I both know that in the world of trying to resolve disputes in court, that's very tight. That's a tight time frame. Yeah.
Yes, it is.
And it could be a lot faster if you can push things through and get it resolved in mediation. Yes. That can be very fast. Okay, so it's like a separate procedure that's similar to civil litigation, but the time frames are really tight.
Yeah, because we're in a different court.
What's at risk is so important. Okay, so I understand there's something other than an IEP, which is colloquially called a 504.
Yes.
What's the difference between those two?
So a 504 does not provide you with much protection as an IEP. So the difference is a 504 is just purely accommodation. So as I mentioned earlier about a student with ADHD or student with like diabetes or asthma, they will qualify under a 504 because they don't really have a learning disability. They don't need services. It's just certain medical accommodation that the child needs so that they can stay in the public school system, like more time on tests, can get an EpiPen, like for food allergies or whatever it may be. So that's what it is. And, these 504s don't have assessments, the meetings are, annual meetings can happen or cannot happen. It is a contract at the same time, but it's just very bare bone of just accommodating the student. An IEP, you have much more protection because every 3 years the student will be reassessed. There are particular goals that the student needs to work on. And if there is no progress within those goals after a year or 2 years, then obviously I would say the district isn't educating the child appropriately. And then there you may have some case for compensatory education. And so there's just more protection, I feel like, under the IEP. So if I will push for an IEP at any time if possible.
Okay. But it might be the case that this particular student disability is just not such that an IEP is necessary, but a 504 might be appropriate. Okay.
For medical, I would say just purely medical reasons. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So let me ask you about the IEP. A new IEP is done every year?
Annual IEP is done every year. And the purpose of that is you have goals that the child is working on for that entire academic year. Has the student met that goal? If the student has met that goal, then what's the next goal that we need to develop so the student can build upon the skill set? If the child didn't meet that goal, then where's the child now? Then do we draft the goal? Do we need more services? So you need to kind of check every year to see where that progress is. That's where you have an annual IEP.
Okay. And then you mentioned another phrase that made my ears perk up, compensatory education. So Talk to us about what that means.
Sure. So prime example would be student has, significant reading challenges, but there's only one reading comprehension goal. And reading as we know it is not just based on comprehension. There's fluency, there's accuracy, there's like the vocabulary building. There's a lot of moving parts. And even with that one reading comprehension goal, the student is not making progress. So you have a student who's entering sixth grade, functioning, reading at a second grade level. So there's a huge discrepancy. But the child has been receiving special education services. So when I look at a case like that, it's like, okay, obviously the student is not making progress. Whatever the district is doing is not working. Therefore, I will sue and say, from the date of filing, I can only allege violations going back 2 years. So it will be for the past 2 years, you failed to educate, so provide a private reading intervention program, and I would ask the district to fund it.
Okay. So it's kind of like tutoring or whatever it is, but the goal is to bring the student up to speed because it hasn't been happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
For whatever reason. Okay. So let me ask you, I would think that a parent discovers that their child has a disability. Probably their first step isn't to hire you. They do things happen, and then they hire you because something's not working, I'm imagining. Mm-hmm. So what steps have typically happened before someone comes to you and says, I think we need your help?
There are a couple of scenarios that happen. So I'll give you the first scenario is the parent requests for special ed services. They get the student assessed. Assessment comes back. The child doesn't qualify or is not eligible for special ed. However, parents have private assessments that they've conducted, and it does clearly show the child requires. So then we're going to be in litigation for that eligibility. So you will need to hire an attorney then. The second is there is a disagreement at an IEP meeting about services or placement. Parents want gen ed, district wants to offer SDC. Parents want a one-on-one, keep the one-on-one aid, district saying that we're going to take it away. They're going to, again, parents want speech, district says, no, we're not going to give you speech anymore. Then that's when you will need to hire an attorney to see, do you have a viable case to move forward to get what you need for the student? Things like that.
Okay. So what are the shortfalls, call it that you are seeing these days, especially in the aftermath of the pandemic? What kinds of things are most commonly happening in your experience?
So one of the things is, if you have a child with significant behavioral challenges, most oftentimes the district will provide a one-on-one aid, right? And that one-on-one aid per the IEP is only supposed to be working with that student. But now what's happening is with the pandemic, the entire world is short-staffed. They will use that aid and have like 2 other students. So then you're kind of taking away services from one kid and then, it's spreading out the resources. So that's not going to work. So that's an issue. The second issue that I see a lot is there are no teachers available. So special education teachers are quitting at a higher rate, and I don't blame them. I mean, it's a lot of work and dedication for the amount of pay. And so substitutes are just shuffling around. So in that particular scenario, even a gen ed student with over 10 substitutes within a 6-month time period will not learn anything. I can almost guarantee it. But with a child with special needs, it's just a complete babysitting gig at that point. So that's what I'm seeing a lot of. And parents are voicing their concerns. Districts are hiding behind this veil of, COVID, and we're trying our best. And that's not good enough for us.
Well, okay. That is fascinating. It is a legitimate explanation. We don't have the staff. We can't find the staff, but it's not a defense. They still have to do it.
Yes, they do still have to do it. Yeah, because there are outside agencies that the district can hire to come and provide the services if the district is unable to do it. So I think just using that COVID as an excuse to not do anything, and it's not acceptable in my opinion.
That's not going to fly. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I think that brings me to some audience questions. I can see that we've got. All right. So can and should a family consult with you to get a clear idea of what they are before they are at an impasse with the school? Is that a good idea? I know what you're going to say.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm an attorney too. Yeah.
Anytime, a mother's hunch, you know what I mean? That intuition that you have, you go in there, you're like, okay, something is not right, but I just cannot pinpoint something isn't right. The teacher is dropping all kinds of clues for me, but she will never, or he will never say it in an IEP meeting. That's the key. That's when you're going to have to go hire an attorney and see, okay, what is going on? Do I have a viable case? What can we do to fix it? before you go into the war zone.
Yeah, that's just good legal advice across the board. It's so much easier if you get the advice up front and you do things correctly than for an attorney to come in at the end and try and clean it up and fix it. So much better, so much less frustration and expense.
It is. I'm going to give you one example why this is so critical that I see a lot recently is, as I mentioned, the lack of teacher available, so the kids are getting hurt, the aid is not there, whatnot. So parents complain, and what the district does is they will provide you with a settlement agreement saying, okay, we will do this for you, sign the settlement agreement. But as an attorney, you will know there's going to be a waiver language in there that says, if you find a claim later on about the things that we didn't do, you forfeit everything. And so parents sign it. When they come to me, it's, I can't do much because you just signed the settlement agreement. So essentially you have no case.
Right. So whatever context you're in, this is always good advice. Don't sign a waiver or settlement agreement without talking to an attorney.
Yes.
Whatever you're talking about, don't waive your rights. It's worth the money to talk to an attorney.
Absolutely. Right. Absolutely.
Okay. So here's another audience question. Are there times where the student has to be placed in a non-public school in order to get appropriate education?
Yes, they do. If the SDC is just not working out, they're in that SDC environment, but there's a lot of functional needs that has to be met. So for example, I have a student who is in middle school, still in diapers, right? That's going to be a problem. So we need to now we're looking at academics as secondary. We need to work on functional skills. And sometimes there are great non-public schools out there, but it's just not many. In a situation like that, I would consider a non-public school so the student could just work on the functional skill sets.
Okay. So when we're talking about non-public schools, that they are just much more geared toward really helping students with a lot of need.
Yeah. So the easy way to think of a non-public school is like a private school, but for students with special needs. And you have to get the funding from the district to go because it's not free.
Right. But the district, if that's the only thing that's going to enable this child to get their education, the district will have to pay for that.
Yes.
Okay. That's part of the free appropriate part. Okay. So Jennifer, thank you so much. This has really been very informative for me. And I know for my audience, I have no doubt that they've heard things that they never even thought about before. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing your expertise. And tell us how people can reach you.
They can call me, email me, and go to my website. I think it's been advertised at the bottom. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So the phone number, just for those who are listening and not watching, 323-931-5270. Or you can go to her website, educationrightsattorney.com. And of course, you can always Google Jennifer Chang and she will come up. So thank you so much, Jennifer. We really appreciate you being here. And thank you all for being here. I hope you got a lot out of it. I know I did. And I hope you'll watch our next episode. And I look forward to connecting with you next time.
Thank you for joining us today for another episode of Absolute Trust Talk Live. If you enjoyed listening in, then don't forget to subscribe. You can find us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you may listen by searching Absolute Trust Talk. While you're there, we would also love for you to leave us a review. And then why not share your favorite episodes with family, friends, or colleagues too? You can find all of our shows and corresponding show notes by visiting absolutetrustcouncil.com. You'll also find a variety of other free resources, including our ebooks, videos, blogs, presentations, and more. If you need help with your estate planning or administration, we also offer a free discovery call to help get the process started. You can find more information on booking your session by visiting absolutetrustcouncil.com/scheduling. Don't forget to keep an eye out for our next live episode in 2 weeks. If you join us for the broadcast, you can submit questions during the show. But if not, don't worry. You can always get in touch with us by sending a quick message to info@absolutetrustcouncil.com. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you soon.
This podcast is not meant to take the place of legal advice from an attorney and does not create an attorney-client relationship. If you do have a legal question or issue, please consult with an attorney.